There's a guy I know named Paul, 58 years old, spent 33 years as a civil engineer. He did everything the financial advisors told him to do, maxed his 401k for 2 decades, never touched it during the 2008 crash, never panic sold in 2020 when the market fell 34% in 5 weeks. He just kept contributing month after month, year after year like clockwork. By early 2026, Paul had $1.1 million saved for retirement. He ran the math. At 4% withdrawal, that's $44,000 a year. Add Social Security at $24,000, and he's pulling $68,000 annually. Enough. Not private island money, but enough. Comfortable. Done. He told his boss in January he'd be out by July. Here's what Paul doesn't know yet. The year he retires might be the single most destructive financial decision of his life. Not because of anything he did wrong. Not because his math is broken, but because of a mechanism that almost nobody in personal finance talks about, and the financial industry has zero incentive to explain clearly. A mechanism so counterintuitive that when you understand it, you'll immediately think of someone in your life who got quietly destroyed by it. Someone who did everything right and still ended up back at work at 68. The mechanism is called sequence of returns risk, and by the time I'm done explaining it, you're going to understand why two people with identical savings, identical strategies, and identical investment returns can end up with completely different retirements. One runs out of money at 78, the other leaves $800,000 to their kids. Same everything, different outcome, because of when the market decided to crash. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've spent years reading the actual actuarial research, the Vanguard white papers, the Morningstar studies on withdrawal rate sustainability, not the summaries, the primary sources. And what I found is this. The financial industry has sold you a retirement plan built on an assumption that sounds reasonable on paper and fails catastrophically in reality. And if you're within 15 years of retirement, you need to understand this before you hand in your notice. Here's the assumption, that average returns are what matter. Every retirement calculator you've ever used operates on this logic. Put in your balance, put in a withdrawal rate, plug in 7% average annual returns, and it tells you whether you'll run out of money. The math looks clean. The projections look solid. The problem is that markets don't give you average returns every year. They give you volatile, unpredictable returns that swing wildly up and down. And when you're accumulating wealth, that volatility is mostly irrelevant. But the moment you start withdrawing from your portfolio, the order of those returns stops being irrelevant. It becomes everything. Let me give you a metaphor that's going to make this click. Imagine you're a farmer with a well. The well holds exactly 10,000 gallons of water. Every year you need to pull 500 gallons to water your crops. That's your withdrawal. And every year rain replenishes the well by some amount. Sometimes a lot, sometimes a little. Sometimes there's a drought and it actually shrinks. On average, over 30 years, the well gets replenished by 7% annually. I'll quote, your planner runs the numbers and says you're fine. Now here's the problem. What happens if the drought comes in year one? You pull 500 gallons for your crops. The drought takes another 3,000. Your well is now at 6,500 gallons instead of 10,000. Next year, you pull another 500. Maybe it rains normally and you gain 7%, but 7% of 6,500 is only 455 gallons. You needed 500 more than the rain gave you. You pull the difference from the well. Year by year, you're draining a smaller and smaller well. The math that looked fine at 10,000 gallons doesn't work at 6,500. You run dry 16 years before the projection said you would. Now flip it. Same well, same 30-year average. But the drought comes in year 25 instead of year 1. By then, you've had 24 years of good rain. The well is at 22,000 gallons. The drought hits and takes 3,000. You've got 19,000 left. Still massive, still sustainable. You retire and die wealthy with water in the well. Same average weather, same farmer, same withdrawal rate. Completely different outcomes because of when the drought arrived. That sequence of returns risk. The market is the weather. Your retirement date is when you start pulling from the well. And if the drought hits in your first 3 to 5 years of retirement, you may never recover, even if the next 20 years are spectacular. Let me make this viscerally real with numbers, because this is where people's brains usually snap into focus. Take two investors. We'll call them Michael and James. Both retire in the same hypothetical period with $1 million. Both use the 4% rule, pulling $40,000 per year. Both experience the same sequence of annual returns over 20 years. The only difference is the sequence is reversed for each of them. Michael retires in a down market. His first 3 years, -15%, -8%, -12%. Then the market recovers. He gets the same strong years James did, just later. By year 20, Michael's portfolio is worth $127,000. He barely made it, a couple of bad medical bills away from disaster. James retires in a strong market. His first 3 years, +22%, +18%, +14%. Then the market crashes, the same crash Michael faced at the beginning. But James faces it from a position of strength, with a portfolio that's already grown substantially. By year 20, James has $1.4 million. He ends retirement richer than he started. Same total returns, same withdrawal rate, same starting balance. $127,000 versus $1.4 million. The only variable was the order. This isn't theory. This is documented math that Vanguard and William Bengen, the researcher who developed the 4% rule in 1994, have written about extensively. The 4% rule was designed around a specific historical sequence that included some bad early years. But it has meaningful failure rates in scenarios where the crash hits right at retirement, not a decade before. And here's the brutal irony that nobody wants to say out loud. Paul, my friend from the beginning of this video, is retiring in July 2026. The S&P 500 has had back-to-back years of roughly 25% returns in 2023 and 2024. Valuations by almost every measure are historically elevated. The Shiller P/E ratio, which smooths earnings over a decade to reduce cyclicality, is at levels that historically precede below-average returns over the following 10 years. Not always a crash. Sometimes just a flat decade. But Paul's retirement model assumes 7% annual returns starting immediately. A flat decade in his first 10 years of withdrawal doesn't just reduce his returns. It structurally compromises whether his portfolio survives. Paul isn't doing anything wrong. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. And the industry isn't telling him. Now let me explain why the financial industry has no incentive to fix this problem. Think about how financial advisors get paid. Most charge a percentage of assets under management, typically 0.5% to 1% annually. On Paul's $1.1 million, that's $5,500 to $11,000 per year. Their fee doesn't change much based on whether Paul's retirement strategy accounts for sequence of returns risk. They get paid either way. More importantly, the solution to sequence of returns risk requires holding more cash, more bonds, more conservative assets in the early years of retirement, and conservative assets generate less growth, which means the portfolio grows more slowly, which means the advisor's fee base grows more slowly. There is a direct financial conflict of interest between your advisor optimizing for sequence of returns protection and your advisor maximizing their fee income. I'm not saying advisors are evil. I'm saying the incentive structure points in the wrong direction, and most people don't know enough to push back. Here's what the research actually shows works. The concept is called a bucket strategy or liability matching, and it's been endorsed by some of the most rigorous retirement researchers alive. The idea is simple but psychologically powerful. You divide your retirement assets into 3 buckets. Bucket 1 is cash, 1 to 2 years of living expenses, sitting in a high-yield savings account or money market fund. This money is not invested. It earns maybe 3 to 4%. It doesn't grow. It doesn't need to. Its only job is to be there when the market is down, so you never have to sell investments at a loss to cover your expenses. Bucket 2 is conservative, 2 to 7 years of expenses, held in short-duration bonds, dividend-paying stocks, REITs, things that generate income and fluctuate less wildly than pure equities. These refill Bucket 1 as you spend it. Bucket 3 is growth, everything else in broad market index funds. This is your long-term engine. It's the part that will be volatile year to year. But because you have 5 to 7 years of expenses covered in buckets 1 and 2, you never have to touch bucket 3 during a crash. You can let it recover. You can even buy more during the downturn. The math on why this matters is staggering. If Paul had a $100,000 crash buffer in bucket 1 and the market dropped 40% in his first year of retirement, he'd spend bucket 1 while his equity portfolio recovered. He wouldn't touch his $1.1 million in stocks. He'd draw from cash. Meanwhile, with no forced selling, his stock portfolio drops from $1 million to $600,000. Painful on paper. But over the next 3 years, as the market recovers, that $600,000 is on its way back to $900,000 and eventually past the original $1 million. The crash becomes a delay, not a catastrophe. Compare that to Paul with no buffer. Same crash. His portfolio drops from $1.1 million to $660,000. He still needs his $40,000 annual withdrawal, so he sells stock at the bottom. He's now down to $620,000. Next year, he sells again. He's locking in losses at the worst possible time. The recovery happens, but he's recovering from a smaller base with ongoing withdrawals eating into it. He runs out of money at 82 instead of leaving a legacy. That's $100,000 in cash protection, potentially saving his entire retirement. Here's the psychological mechanism that makes this work. The biggest danger in retirement isn't the market. It's your brain reacting to the market. When a working person sees their portfolio drop 30%, it's painful. But they know they're not touching it. They have a salary. They can wait. Their emotions might spike, but the structural situation doesn't force a bad decision. A retired person watching their portfolio drop 30% faces a completely different psychological reality. They need the money. The bill is due. The instinct to sell, to stop the bleeding, to go to cash and wait for stability is overwhelming. And acting on that instinct is catastrophic. It converts a temporary paper loss into a permanent real loss and then leaves you sitting in cash while the recovery happens without you. History shows people who went to cash in March 2020 and didn't get back in missed one of the fastest recoveries in market history. That single emotional decision, justified in the moment, cost some retirees 15 years of gains. The bucket strategy solves this. When the market is crashing and your brain is screaming at you to do something, you look at bucket 1 and you see 18 months of expenses. Well, you physically can afford to do nothing. The strategy gives your rational brain a fact to hold on to when your emotional brain is trying to hijack the controls. Let me give you a concrete action framework. 5 steps. This is what I would do if I were within 10 years of retirement. Step 1. Calculate your real burn rate. Not what you earn, what you actually spend. Rent or mortgage, food, healthcare, transportation, subscriptions, travel, gifts, all of it. Be honest. Most people underestimate by 15 to 20% because they forget the irregular stuff. Medical expenses average $6,000 to $7,000 per year for a retired couple, and that's with Medicare. Add that in. Your burn rate number is the foundation of every other calculation. Step 2. Calculate your sequence of returns risk exposure. So take your portfolio balance and multiply it by the withdrawal rate you plan to use. If you have $800,000 and plan to take 4%, that's $32,000 per year from the portfolio. Now ask, if the market drops 35% in my first year and I still need $32,000, am I selling stocks at the bottom? If the answer is yes, you have meaningful sequence risk. If the answer is no because you have cash or bonds covering that $32,000, your risk is manageable. Step 3. Build bucket 1 before you retire. Not after, before. In the 2 to 3 years leading up to retirement, stop adding aggressively to equities and start building your cash and short-term bond buffer. Yes, this might mean slightly lower returns in those final years. It also means you're not forced to retire at exactly the wrong moment of the market cycle just because you hit a date on a calendar. So step 4, match your withdrawal rate to your real sequence risk exposure, not some historical average. The 4% rule assumes a 30-year retirement with a diversified portfolio and reasonable starting valuations. If you're retiring at 55, your retirement could be 40 years. And the 4% rule has meaningful failure rates over that horizon. If valuations are elevated when you retire, as they are now, the research suggests 3% to 3.5% is safer. That's not catastrophic. On $1 million, that's still $30,000 to $35,000 before Social Security. Step 5. Create a written policy for what you'll do during a crash. This sounds strange, but it's critical. Write down before the crash happens what your rules are. If the market drops 20%, I will not sell equities. I will draw from bucket 1. I will evaluate rebalancing opportunities. If the market drops 40%, same rules. The reason you write this down in advance is that when the crash actually happens, your brain will manufacture dozens of reasons why this time is different, and you should sell. The written policy is your past self, calm and rational, overruling your future self, panicked and irrational. Institutions do this. Endowments have investment policy statements exactly for this reason. You should too. Now let's zoom out to the macro picture. Because the individual mechanics of sequence risk don't exist in a vacuum. They exist inside a broader economic environment that makes retiring in the next 3 to 5 years structurally more dangerous than retiring in 2015 was. Here's the setup. Valuations, as measured by almost any long-term metric, are at elevated levels. And the forward price-to-earnings ratio on the S&P 500 is high by historical standards. That doesn't mean a crash is imminent. Markets can stay expensive for years. But it does mean that the expected returns for the next 10 years are lower than the expected returns were in 2009, when everything was cheap. When you combine elevated valuations with ongoing government debt expansion, a Federal Reserve that has limited room to cut rates dramatically, and the largest cohort of Americans ever approaching retirement simultaneously, you have a structural environment that is specifically hostile to people retiring right now without adequate sequence risk protection. The baby boomers, 73 million of them, are exiting the workforce in waves. The peak of that wave runs roughly from 2025 through 2030. And that means tens of millions of people transitioning from net buyers of stocks to net sellers of stocks over the same 5-year window. When that many people are simultaneously withdrawing from retirement accounts, it creates structural selling pressure on equities. Not a crash necessarily, but persistent headwinds that make flat to below average returns more likely than they've historically been. If you're retiring into that environment without sequence risk protection, you're not just taking normal retirement risk. You're taking retirement risk in specifically hostile conditions. The people who will emerge from this period wealthy are the ones who understood that retirement income planning and accumulation planning are completely different games with different rules. Accumulation is simple. Invest consistently, take risk. But time heals all wounds. Retirement income is a sequencing problem, a liquidity problem, a behavioral problem. The same aggressive equity allocation that built your wealth is the wrong tool for the job of sustainable distribution. Not because stocks are bad, because the order of returns matters now in a way it never did when you were adding money instead of removing it. Here's what the actual research recommends for the optimal asset allocation in the first 5 years of retirement. It's not 70% stocks and 30% bonds, which is what most target date funds give you. It's closer to 40 to 50% equities, 20 to 30% bonds, and 20 to 30% in short duration cash equivalents. More conservative than the conventional wisdom, more boring, more likely to preserve your retirement across different market scenarios. And in years 6 through 10, assuming the market hasn't crashed, you gradually increase equity exposure back towards 60 to 70%, because by then, your sequence risk has diminished substantially. You survived the danger zone. Here's the final thing I want you to sit with. Paul, from the beginning of this video, is going to be fine. Or he might not be. He genuinely has no idea, and neither does anyone else, because markets are unpredictable. But what I know for certain is that he's retiring without understanding the single most important risk factor specific to his situation. He's walking across a minefield he doesn't know is there. And the tragedy isn't that he got unlucky. The tragedy is that the information exists. The research is published. The tools are available. The bucket strategy isn't complicated. The sequencing math isn't advanced. It's just not in the standard retirement conversation. Your brokerage isn't going to call you up and say, hey, by the way, here's a scenario where you do everything right and still run out of money. That call doesn't happen. So the question is whether you're going to be the person who finds out about this in advance and builds a plan, or the person who finds out at 74 when the math finally tells you what you didn't want to know. Time doesn't wait for you to feel ready. The market doesn't adjust its schedule to accommodate your retirement date. The sequence that plays out in the first 3 years after you stop working will disproportionately determine everything that comes after. That is not an opinion, it is arithmetic. If this video made you think differently about your own timeline, take one action this week. Pull up your current retirement account allocation. Look at how much is in equities versus cash versus bonds. Calculate how many months of expenses your non-equity holdings represent. If that number is less than 12, you have sequence risk exposure worth addressing before it addresses you. And if you're more than 5 years from retirement, forward this to someone who isn't. Hit subscribe if you want to keep understanding how this stuff actually works, not how it's sold to you. Drop a comment with what year you're planning to retire, and if you're already past that date, tell me what the sequence looked like, because real data is worth more than any projection. The next video is about the specific withdrawal strategies that outperform the 4% rule across multiple market scenarios. See you there.